Welcome everyone, welcome to 2021 and welcome to our new series of British Museum Talks in association with Camden Community Adult Learning. And today's talk is all about famous Black Britons who form part of the British Museum collections. And the British Museum collections include not only 3D objects, but we have a very large collection of 2D prints, drawings, and even a few paintings. So the images we're going to be looking at today are all images of people who have lived in Britain from Roman times up to modern times. And we're going to be looking at a selection of those individuals, particularly where we know the names and the life stories of those people. And I'm going to show you a number of images on screen. They are all from the British Museum collection. Some of the objects are on public display. Others can be found on our collection database, Collections Online, where if you use the search term Black Britons, you will be able to pull up a large number of objects relating to the Black community in Britain back to Roman times. I'm just going to start sharing my screen. So one moment. I'm going to pick up my PowerPoint and we will begin from the beginning. Always a good place to start, I feel. I'm also going to just pick up my laser pointer. You can see my little black laser pointer. I'm going to remove my video so we can concentrate on our lovely British Museum objects. So, famous Black Britons, life stories in the British Museum collection. And we're going to begin in Roman times. And we have in our collection two objects which speak to the Black presence in the Roman Empire and specifically in Britain. So Roman Britain, we're talking here about a time when England and Wales were part of the Roman Empire. Now, the Roman Empire at its peak had territories stretching from northwest Europe across to North Africa and into the Near East. And the Roman army was stationed across the empire, bringing people from different territories to Britain. The figure we can see on the left is a cavalry soldier from Roman North Africa. His horse is missing, as is part of his arm, but we can see that he is carrying his shield, and originally he would have been mounted on his horse. Now, altar inscriptions from northern England tell us that a North African unit was in Britain from about AD 200 right up until the end of Roman Britain around AD 411. And it was based at the fort nowadays known as Burr-on-Sands at the western end of Hadrian's Wall. And it was probably brought over to serve in Britain as an auxiliary cavalry unit by the Emperor Septimus Severus, who we can see here on the left, who was himself a North African. Now, Septimus was Roman Emperor from AD 193 to 211. His mother's family had moved from Italy to North Africa. His father's family were of North African heritage. Septimus himself grew up in Roman North Africa. He spoke the local Punic language fluently. He also learned Latin and Greek, but we're told from the sources that he always spoke both these languages with a slight accent. Now, Severus himself travelled to Britain in 208 when he ordered the strengthening of Hadrian's Wall and the reoccupation of the Antinian Wall further north. Scotland was never formally part of the Roman Empire. The furthest north the Romans got was this Antinian Wall, but later on they had to fall back to the Hadrian's Wall, which we more commonly know as the northern boundary of Roman Britain. Now, Severus himself invaded Caledonia, modern Scotland, but his plans to make Scotland part of the empire were cut short when he fell ill late in 2010. He died early the next year in York, although his body was returned to Rome for burial. These two figures are the two earliest portraits we have of people from a Black community living or visiting Britain. In terms of the diversity of the Roman Empire, York Museum have recently published information about a woman known as the Ivory Bangle Lady, a wealthy Roman from Africa who lived in the city of York in the AD 300s. There's also remains in the Museum of London of a lady of African heritage buried in the city. Apart from very famous figures such as the emperor himself, the names of other individuals are usually lost. And in terms of the small African cavalry figure that we have here, we know where his probable posting was, up in northern England. We know when the unit in which he served was stationed there. But in terms of him as an individual, his name, his life before and after his posting in Britain, we have no current information. If we then move forward in time to Tudor times, we meet our first individual in the British Museum archives who spent a substantial part of his life in Britain and for whom we have a name as well as documented evidence from court records of the time. So this is John Blanke. John Blanke was a musician at the Tudor court. He was a trumpeter at royal events and was employed by both Henry VII and Henry VIII. He probably came to England as one of the African attendants of Katharine of Aragon, who arrived from Spain in 1501 to marry Henry VIII's older brother, Prince Arthur. Prince Arthur subsequently died, and as we know, she went on to marry his younger brother, Henry VIII, and became the first of Henry's 6 wives. Now, nothing's known about John's life before he arrived in Plymouth with Katharine of Aragon. Royal accounts show a payment of 20 shillings to John Blanke, the Black Trumpeter, for November 1507, with monthly payments of the same amount throughout the next year. So we have a well-documented archive trail for his life at the Tudor court. And in addition to his wages, John would have received room and board as a member of the royal household. He appears again in 1509, following the death of a senior trumpeter, Dominic Justinian. And at this point, John petitions Henry VIII for his former colleague's position. John says that his wages are not sufficient for him to serve the king properly, as he puts it, as your other trumpets do, and states that he intends to serve the king for the rest of his life. His petition is successful, and his wages were doubled from 8 old pence a day to 16 old pence a day. And that's a bit like John's standing charge. That is what he gets paid every day, with additional payments when he performs at particular royal events. And we can see one of these royal events in this, the 1511 Westminster Tournament Roll. Now, this is a print. The original piece, which was created at the time on vellum, is held by the College of Arms. And our print, which is a copy taken in Georgian times, shows us John Blanke twice. Here in the top right-hand corner, and again in the bottom left-hand corner. And he is taking part as a group of 6 trumpeters on horseback, celebrating the birth of Henry, Duke of Cornwall. Now, Henry, Duke of Cornwall was the son of Henry VIII and Queen Catherine. Unfortunately, he died in infancy. But this is the tournament which was held to celebrate his birth, to celebrate the arrival of Henry's heir, the continuation of the Tudor dynasty in February 1511. John himself was married in 1512, the next year, and documents show that on the 14th of April of that year at Greenwich Palace, Henry VIII gifted John a wedding outfit, which included a gown of violet velvet and a hat, an indication of royal favour and also an indication of John's status within the royal household. Now, this, unfortunately, is the last known record of John Blanke. The next full set of royal trumpeters, which was drawn up 2 years later in 1514, doesn't include his name. So we have no information on John after this date. Perhaps he remained in Britain, but changed profession. Perhaps he died, or perhaps he moved abroad to work at another royal court. Now, we know that African musicians were employed at this time at the court of the Scottish king, James IV, where they appear in royal archive documents in 1505. And here on the left, we have a French tapestry, currently in a private collection, not in the British Museum collection. Neither of these objects on this slide are in the British Museum collection. They give us a nice context, though, for the life of John Blanke, because this French tapestry shows an African trumpeter employed by the French court. His trumpet bears the coat of arms of the French court, and he is playing at a wrestling match which took part at the Field of Cloth of Gold in 1520, which was a meeting between Henry VIII and the French king, Francois I. The other image shows a group of African musicians, and they are painted onto an altarpiece, which was commissioned in 1522 by Queen Eleanor of Portugal for a convent in Lisbon. The piece is now in the National Museum of Ancient Art in Lisbon. Queen Elizabeth I, back in Britain, had at least one African in her personal entourage, and records show that in April 1574, Elizabeth ordered a lined coat of white taffeta striped with gold and silver thread, knitted stockings, and white shoes to be made for the African boy. His name is not listed, but we know he was at court until at least the next April, when he is granted another set of clothing. After which, as with John Blanke, his name is lost in the archives and we are uncertain of his later life. If we move on to the late Stuart period, we know that historian David Olusoka says that a Black community, a stable Black community living in Britain, emerged from the 1680s. And members of this community can be seen in British Museum objects of the time. Now, members of elite households, such as the two images we see to the right, often include information about people in the household beyond the immediate family. Now, if we go over to the left, we see a chalk drawing in the British Museum collection by Godfrey Kneller, a court painter. And it shows a young boy of African heritage, drawn twice in the same pose. And it was drawn, we believe, between 1685 and 1690. And it's probably a young page boy from a noble household. Pages were young male servants who lived as part of the household, worked in the public areas of the house, attending to guests, as well as the private family areas as personal attendants. And pages would wear a uniform to indicate their role within the household. The name and life story of this page boy is currently unknown. Now, the drawing itself has been proposed as a study for several different paintings by Kneller. And these different paintings are the only clue we have to the life of this page boy in Britain. Now, the first painting that has been suggested is The print, this is a print, the original painting is held at Brooksby Park in Lincolnshire, and it shows Frederick, Duke of Schomberg, who was an officer in the army of King William III. And just behind him, we see an African page who attends him with his armour. And we see the Duke readying himself for battle. Now, the dates fit because the Duke, we know, died in the early stages of the Battle of the Boyne. And so the Battle of the Boyne, which took place in 1691, fits in nicely with the presumed dates for the chalk drawing. However, the young attendant in this painting, British Museum print, looks older than Nella's page boy. So it's a possible match, but I think this attendant looks older. We then move to the second suggested picture. Now, we don't have a print of this, so this is a picture I have found from the internet. It is a painting which is at Audley End in Essex of the actress Mary Davis. The page boy who attends her is the right age, but his pose is considerably different from that in the chalk drawing. And we often find from comparing prints to paintings that artists will often make a fairly faithful reproduction of their initial sketch into the final composition of the painting. In addition, his facial expression is quite different. So let's move on to the third suggestion. Now, the third suggestion, which I think is probably the most likely fit, is that it's a study for a portrait of Mary Butler, Duchess of Ormond, who has a page holding her dress. Now, the location of the original painting is unknown, but the British Museum holds a print which was created in 1702. So the original painting was probably painted at some point between 1685 and 1701. So that fits nicely with the presumed dates for our drawing. Now, an undated account of the staff at Ormond House, where the Duchess lived, in St James's Square, Westminster, in the late 1600s, lists 40 household staff. And that would have included staff working within the family residence, and also stable staff with a large stable of 5 coaches, 20 horses and 14 dogs with associated staff. But it seems likely that our young page boy was based within the main family residence and would have been working in the public areas of the house when the Duke and Duchess were attended by guests, and may well have worked in the more private areas of the house, as we see him here associated with the dress and the movement of the Duchess between the private and the public areas of her house, wearing her finest garments and jewellery. If this is correct, we know where this young page boy worked. We know that as well as the family's other residences, he probably spent some time in Westminster at their house there. We have no record of his name, and unfortunately, currently no information is known about how he arrived in Britain and became part of the Duke and Duchess's household, or his later life. Now, the next person we're going to meet worked in a Georgian coffee house. And apart from her employment at the coffee house, we currently have no further information about her life. We know she's called Betty, and we can see her in this print busy working at Tom King's, later Moll King's, coffee house, which stood next to St Paul's Church in Covent Garden in London. Now, the coffee house itself may have opened as early as 1717, and it's certainly listed as operating in documents which record the businesses of the Borough of Westminster in 1730. The owners were Tom and Moll King, and after her husband's death, Moll continued to run it until she retired in 1745. Now, the business was very profitable because we know with the money that she and her husband had made, they were able to buy land and build a house on Haverstock Hill near Hampstead Heath, and that is the house to which she retired. Betty herself is named in several documents which indicate that she worked at the coffee house during the 1730s, possibly earlier. And Betty is said in these documents to have attended guests, customers, and served coffee. And this is exactly what we see her doing in the print to the left, bringing a jug of coffee. The coffee house is also known to have served hot chocolate and tea, and she appears to be bringing a drinking vessel. Now, the only caveat I would say is that whilst we can see little coffee cups on the table, which Betty might be filling from her jug, she's actually holding what looks like a glass. There's also one on the table. So I suspect that Betty may have wine in her jug, possibly not coffee, chocolate, or tea. Customers at the coffee house included the artist William Hogarth, the poet Alexandra Pope, the dramatist John Gay, the novelist Henry Fielding, and even King George II himself, all of whom Betty would have served, since her work consisted of a public fronting role, serving at the bar and the tables in the coffee house. The print on the left is a satirical print, sorry, the print on the right is a satirical print dating to 1737, and it features a funeral monument for King Tom King, owner of the coffee house where Betty worked. Now, King himself lounges against an inverted punch bowl, holding a ladle in his hand, which backs up our idea that Betty would have served alcoholic beverages alongside the coffee, chocolate and tea. And opposite, we have Betty herself kneeling down with her arms raised in grief as she mourns his death. We don't know whether he was actually dead at the time when the satirical print was published, but if we go up to the top, we can see the coffee pot and the chocolate pot representative, along with the barrels of brandy, of the beverages that would have been served at Betty's coffee house. The next person we're going to meet is Frances Barber. Now, Frances Barber, who we can see here in a drawing from the British Museum on the left, was born in Jamaica, which at the time of his birth was a British colony. He was born around 1735, and when he was born, he is listed as being named Quancy, which suggests he may have been born on a Sunday. In 1750, we know he was baptised in London, receiving the name Francis Barber, which is the name he used at school and for the rest of his life. His friend and employer, Dr. Samuel Johnson, called him Frank, a common shortening of Francis. Now, going slightly backward, we know that Francis had been born and grew up on the plantation in Jamaica of Colonel Bathurst. Now, Colonel Bathurst sold his plantation in 1750 and moved to England. He brought Francis with him. And for a year, when he first arrived in England, Francis went to school in Barton, Yorkshire, where he learned to read and write. Afterwards, he stayed in Britain working for the plantation owner's son, Richard Bathurst, who was a close friend of Samuel Johnson. In April 1752, 2 weeks after the death of Johnson's wife, Francis went to work as a valet for Johnson in his house in Gough Square, London. And the coloured print to the right shows Johnson's house, shows Dr. Johnson himself arriving home, and Francis Barber standing greeting him at the door. Now in 1754, Bathurst died, and he left in his will Francis £12 and also his freedom. At this point, Francis was no longer obliged to continue working for Samuel Johnson as a valet and household servant. And we know that Francis immediately, upon being granted his freedom, moved to Cheapside, where he took work as an apothecary, modern-day pharmacist, occasionally continuing to visit Johnson. Around 1758, Francis enlisted in the British Navy. He served on HMS Stag, but was discharged in August 1760 at the assistance of Samuel Johnson, who was not best pleased that Francis had left his service and indeed enlisted in the Navy. He thought this was far too perilous a life for young Frank. In 1767, Johnson paid for Francis to attend Bishop Stortford Grammar School in Hertfordshire, and Francis continued to study there for 5 years before returning to London. When he came back to London, he returned to the employ of Samuel Johnson and continued to work as Johnson's valet and secretary until Johnson died. Francis was responsible for arranging trips, receiving documents, and keeping Johnson's diary. Around 1773, Francis married Elizabeth Ball. They had 3 children, and the whole family lived with Johnson in his house in Gough Square. Francis assisted Johnson in revising his Dictionary of the English Language and other works. And Francis was later an important source for Johnson's biographer, James Boswell, being able as he was to tell Boswell about events in Johnson's life in the years before Boswell had known Johnson. And what we see alongside our print is a teapot in the British Museum collection. This teapot was actually owned by Samuel Johnson, so would have been used in the household at the same time as Francis Barber and his family were living there. And it was left to one of Johnson's friends in his will and was then forwarded down through her family and eventually bequeathed to the British Museum. Now, talking of Johnson's will, in his will, Johnson made Francis his principal heir, and he left him £70, which equates to about £9,000 in modern terms, £70 a year to be issued by the trustees of the will. He also expressed a will that Francis should go to live in Lichfield, Staffordshire, which was Johnson's native city. Francis was also left Johnson's books and papers and a gold watch. Johnson felt that Lichfield, his birthplace, would be a good city for Francis to bring his family up in and live, as it would be cheaper than continuing to live in London. And here we see a view of Georgian Lichfield and the actual house in which Samuel Johnson was born, in the accommodation above Johnson's father's bookshop. And Samuel Johnson actually lived here for the first 27 years of his life before he arrived in London. The opposite side, we have Lichfield Marketplace, and again, Johnson's birthplace. Francis and his family did indeed move to Lichfield after Johnson's death, and they rented a terraced house in the city. Francis was not a good money manager and eventually had to sell some of the papers and the gold watch he had inherited from Johnson. Now, sometime between 1794 and 1797, Francis opened a school in Burnwood, a small village near Lichfield, possibly making him Britain's first black school teacher. And we know that in 1799, Francis and his wife Elizabeth were living in Burnwood with their children, Elizabeth, Samuel, and Anne. Francis himself died in Stafford Infirmary in 1801, at which point his family moved back to Lichfield, where his daughter, Anne, and his wife opened a day school in the town. His son, Samuel, became a Methodist lay preacher, and his descendants still live in the area. The next famous Black African we are going to meet is an African who is known as an abolitionist, an anti-imperialist, and a natural rights philosopher, active in England in the late 1700s. He is known as Ottobah Cugoano, and he was born around 1757 in modern Ghana. In 1770, at the age of 13, he was kidnapped by slave traders together with other local children, sold into slavery, and transported on a slave ship to the British colony of Grenada. Here, he was sold as an enslaved worker and set to work on a sugar plantation. In 1772, he was purchased by Alexander Campbell, an English merchant who took him to England, where he learned to read and write. In England, he became free following the ruling in the Somerset case, 1772. On the 20th of August, 1773, he was baptised in St James's Church, Piccadilly, and given the name John Stuart, although he is more commonly known in books and documents and archives by his name Ottobar. Now, to the left, we have a portrait of Ottobar with the artists Richard and Maria Cosway. And the other print to the right shows Ottobar with an artist palette, probably painting in the household of the artists, where he lived and worked from at least 1784. Whilst living with the Cosways, he got to know British political and cultural figures, including the poet William Blake and the Prince of Wales, later George IV. He joined the Sons of Africa, a group of African abolitionists in England, and he became a leading figure within the contemporary Black British community. Ottobar wrote against slavery and sent letters calling for its abolition to the London newspapers. He also published a book called Thoughts and Sentiments on the Evil and Wicked Traffic of the Slavery and Commerce of the Human Species. This was published in 1787 and is the major source for his own life story, since it includes an account of his enslavement. The book was reprinted at least 3 times and later translated into French. He later published a shorter, more commercial version in 1791, in which he called for the immediate abolition of the slave trade and the emancipation of all enslaved people. In that year, 1791, we know he travelled to over 50 places in Britain, promoting the book and speaking against the slave trade. We also know that he disagreed publicly with William Wilberforce, who he described as a hypocrite for refusing to support the campaign to end slavery, not just in Britain, but across the whole British Empire. This, what we would call nowadays book tour of 1791, is the last definite record we have of Ottobar, and nothing is currently known about his life after this date. Our next object is a drawing held by the British Museum, dating from around 1790. And this is the only surviving portrait known from the early years of George Bridgetower. And it was drawn when he arrived in London. Now, he was actually born George Augustus Holgreen Bridgetower in Poland around 1782. His Barbados-born father had arrived in Europe in the 1770s, married a German woman, and was working as a personal page at the Hungarian court by 1780. His son George was a skilled musician and made his professional violin debut in Paris in 1789 before travelling on to London with his father, which is where this drawing was made. George performed for members of the royal court in London and gave public recitals in both Bath and Bristol. We know that by 1790, George was performing in Drury Lane Theatre, where he was heard by the Prince of Wales, later George IV, who was a keen cellist himself, and the Prince arranged for George to have additional music lessons, and later George became the principal violinist in the Prince's orchestra. Between 1789 and 1799, George performed over 50 concerts in London theatres, including Covent Garden, Drury Lane, and the Haymarket Theatre. And in 1792 and 1794, he played alongside the well-known Austrian composer, Joseph Haydn. In 1802, he travelled to Dresden to visit his mother and his younger brother, Frederick, who played the cello. And he performed in 1803 in Vienna, where he met the composer Beethoven. Now, Beethoven was working on a sonata at the time, which George became the first violinist ever to perform it in public. And Beethoven had intended to name the sonata after George. Unfortunately, they quarrelled and Beethoven decided to name it after a French violinist instead. He did, however, bequeath George his tuning fork, and that tuning fork is nowadays held as part of the collection at the British Library, just up the road from the British Museum on the Euston Road. After performing in Vienna, George returned to England, where he attended Cambridge University and graduated with a Bachelor of Music degree in 1811. After this, he taught, composed, and continued performing. And in 1813, he performed in the first concert of the Philharmonic Society of London. He married Mary Leake in 1816 and later travelled abroad, particularly to Italy, where his daughter lived. He died in Peckham in 1860, aged 78. And in his will, he left an estate of £1,000, which went to his sister-in-law. His wife had died by now, so he left the residue of his estate to his dead wife's sister, and he was buried in Kensal Green Cemetery, London. The next famous Black Briton we're going to meet is Ignatius Sancho, and this is a print from the British Museum collections based on an oil painting currently held in the National Gallery of Canada, painted in Bath of Ignatius by Thomas Gainsborough. Now, Ignatius was born in Africa around 1729. He and his parents were taken from Africa to South America as enslaved people. His father is reported to have taken his own life rather than live as an enslaved worker. And his mother died in the Spanish colony of modern Grenada, modern day Colombia, soon after they arrived. In the Spanish colony, he was baptized and given the name Ignatius. Age 2, the young Ignatius was taken by his slave owner to England, where he was given to 3 sisters who lived together in Greenwich. He lived with them from around 1731 to 1749. And it was the sisters who gave him the name Sancho, because they thought he looked like the squire in the story of Don Quixote. It may also have been a reference to the fact that the young Sancho was probably aware of, may even have spoken a few words of Spanish, the language he was surrounded by in South America. Ignatius taught himself to read and write, and whilst living in Greenwich, he met the Duke of Montague, who lived in nearby Blackheath. And the Duke of Montague encouraged Ignatius to read and lent him books from his personal library. In 1749, Ignatius left the service of the Greenwich sisters and presented himself at Montague House in Blackheath, where for the next 2 years he worked as a butler to the Duchess of Montague. During this time, he wrote poetry, a book on music, and 2 plays. He was also a composer and has 3 published collections of songs, minuets, and music for the violin, flute, and harpsichord. And copies of these books are amongst the collections held at the British Library. He loved the theatre and regularly went to Drury Lane to see David Garrett, the famous Shakespearean actor who became a firm friend. When the Duchess of Montague died in 1751, Ignatius received an annuity, which means an annual payment of £30, worth nowadays about £7,000 a year. During the 1760s, Ignatius married a lady called Anne Osborne, and they had 7 children. In 1766, Sancho, continuing in the employment of the Montague family, became valet, personal manservant to George Montague, who was by now the Duke of Montague. He was the son-in-law of the original Duke of Montague, who Ignatius had known when he lived in Greenwich. And in 1768, the aforementioned portrait, now in Canada, was painted by Thomas Gainsborough. He continued working for the Duke until 1773. And in 1776, he had written to the famous writer Lawrence Sterne, encouraging him to argue in support of the abolition of the slave trade. The letters they wrote were published, after which Sancho became a famous writer and letterist. Ignatius is said to have felt that although he had lived in Britain since he was 2, that at times he felt that he was only a lodger and hardly that. And he quite graphically describes racial abuse which he received, being stared at, followed, and on one occasion actually stopped without his wife and most generously insulted. With the annuity which he was left, in 1774, Ignatius opened a grocery shop at 9 Charles Street, Westminster, which afforded him more time to meet other writers, actors, artists, and politicians. In addition, purchasing the property in Charles Street meant that as a financially independent male householder, he was qualified to vote in the parliamentary elections of 1774 and 1780, and he is the first person of African origin known to have voted in Britain. He died in 1780 and he's buried in the churchyard of St Margaret's, Westminster, and he's the first person of African descent known to have been given an obituary in the British press. After his death, his letters and memoirs were published, And we can see here to the right, the frontispiece from the 5th edition of his letters, which was accompanied by a short memoir, set of recollections about his life, written by Joseph Jekyll. And this 5th edition was published in 1802, and it was published by William Sancho. And William Sancho was one of Ignatius's children. He took over the business at Charles Street, which interestingly on this frontispiece is listed as number 20 rather than 19. But we know that he established a publishing house, reprinted a 5th edition of his father's letters, thus becoming the first black publisher in Europe. On the left-hand side, we can again see the address, Charles Street, Westminster, this time with the correct number in number 19. And this is held in the British Museum collections and is what we call tobacco paper, the thin bit of paper in which you roll a cigarette. And it advertises Sancho's best Trinidadian tobacco. The shop that he ran in Westminster was a general grocery store selling in particular tobacco, sugar and tea. Now, the next person we're going to meet, Phyllis Wheatley, visited London but actually spent the majority of her life in America. Now, the first English settlement in North America was Jamestown, which was established in 1607. By the mid-1700s, Britain had 13 colonies on the Atlantic coast. These colonies declared independence in 1776, leading to the American War of Independence. In 1783, Britain recognised their independence, out of which developed the modern United States of America. Now, Phyllis Wheatley herself was born around 1753, and she was born in West Africa, most likely in present-day Gambia or Senegal. Aged about 7 or 8, she was sold into slavery and transported in 1761 to Boston, a city at that point in the British colony of Massachusetts. And the ship on which she was transported was called the Phyllis, hence her first name of Phyllis. In Boston, she worked as a domestic servant in the household of John Wheatley, a wealthy merchant and tailor. Her birth name is unknown, but on starting to work for the Wheatleys, she was given their surname, thus her published name, Phyllis Wheatley. Phyllis learnt to read and write and started from an early age to study Greek and Latin, and wrote her first published poem at the age of 14. In 1773, she travelled with Nathaniel Wheatley, who was the son of George and Susanna, to London. And this is where her book of poetry was published. And this is a coloured frontispiece from the book of poetry published in London. Now, shortly afterwards, Susanna Wheatley died and Phyllis was formally freed by the Wheatley family. Shortly afterwards, Phyllis met and married John Peters, who was a free black grocer, and they had a son. Phyllis continued to write and wrote over 140 poems, some published in pamphlets and newspapers, over the remainder of her life. Her husband was unfortunately imprisoned for debt in 1784, and Phyllis was forced to work as a scullery maid at a boarding house in Boston. She suffered from chronic asthma and unfortunately died in 1784 aged 31, her infant son dying shortly afterwards. However, a posthumous collection of her work was published in Boston in 1738. And Phyllis Wheatley and her poetry brings us to our comfort break. So we are now going to take a 10-minute break, after which we will return to the life stories of Black Britons and learn about a young man who worked in Hertfordshire, known as Kingston. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. And as she says, we're now going to break for 10 minutes. Now, what's it, 11:56? So we'll be back at 12:06. I will see you all then. Thank you very much. Hello and welcome back to the second half of our workshop. And now Catherine will continue with Black Lives in Britain. Over to you, Catherine.
Thank you very much indeed, Malcolm. Well, we're going to continue, as I said, with oh, come on, my screen has decided it wants to freeze. Come on, screen. There we go. Here is young Kingston, who I said we were going to start the second half of our talk with. And Kingston, who we can see sitting on the far right, we know worked as a domestic servant at Casbury House in Hertfordshire, which is the estate of the Earl of Essex. The house itself was demolished in 1927, but the surrounding parkland was turned into a public open space for Watford. And what we see here in this drawing, dated the 23rd of February 1774, is young Kingston sitting in the kitchen of the house in conversation with the cook in the centre and a coachman on the far left, who is also dozing. And they seem to be discussing who should go to attend a bell ring. Now, two other names are mentioned in the text below, Molly and Polly, and they may have been other domestic servants, or Molly or Polly may have been the name of the cook. But what's interesting is if you look up at the clock, it is obvious that this has clearly been a very long night for the household staff. The clock shows 5 minutes to 1 o'clock in the morning. Thus their discussion about which of them should go up to the public rooms to answer the bell. Now, apart from this drawing, we have no further life about Kingston. We don't know how he arrived in Britain, and we don't know how long he continued in the service of the Earl of Essex. We do know about other Africans who had worked in households and then become independently wealthy people running their own businesses. And they give us a possible insight into Kingston's later life. One of these is George Africanus. Now, this is a picture not from the British Museum collections. I haven't been able to identify where the original painting is held, but it seems to show George Africanus as a teenager in the service of Benjamin Molyneux. Now, George Africanus was born in 1763 in Sierra Leone, West Africa. Age 3, he was taken from Africa to England, where he entered the household of said Benjamin Molyneux, who was a wealthy Wolverhampton businessman. And in 1766, he was baptized George John Skippole Africanus in St. Peter's Church, which is shown in the print to the right, which is a print of Wolverhampton Marketplace in 1799, looking very much as it probably did when George was living in the town. He learned to read and write, and he served as an apprentice brass founder in one of the Molyneux family's foundries. In 1784, he moved to Nottingham to continue working as a brass founder. In Nottingham, he met and married Esther Shaw, who was a milliner. Around 1793, he appears to have given up his career as a brass founder, since he and his wife Esther founded the Africanus Register of Servants, an employment agency which matched servants looking for work with employers in the town looking for servants. And they ran this business from their home at 28 Chandler's Lane, Nottingham. Nottingham at the time was one of the main textile producing centres in Britain. And on the right, you can see a print of a stocking frame machine. At this point, production of textiles was moving from a home industry to a more mechanised industry running in the new textile factories. And a group of people known as the Luddites protested against machines such as this installed en masse in the new textile factories, saying that they were taking work away from the hand weavers. And in 1811, there was a peaceful demonstration in Nottingham's marketplace, which we can see to the left, which later escalated into widespread destruction of these knitting frames in Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire. In response to these riots in Nottingham, a type of Georgian neighbourhood watch, known as the Watch and Ward, was established, and George himself is listed as a member in 1816. Now, George owned his family home in Chandler's Lane, Nottingham, as well as business premises and additional accommodation which he rented out. And as such, this made him eligible to vote. He died in 1834, aged 70, and he's buried in the churchyard of St Mary's Church, Nottingham. And his obituary was printed in the Nottingham Journal in May 1834. Our next coloured print is an image of a gentleman called Bill Richmond. Now, Bill Richmond was born in 1763 in New York, at that time a British colony. He grew up in the household of a local wealthy rector, and aged 13 entered the service of a British general who was commanding British forces in New York during the American War of Independence. Age 14, he was sent to England, where he went to school in Yorkshire before beginning an apprenticeship as a cabinet maker in York. Here he met and married Mary Dunwick. The couple had several children while living in the city. At the same time, Bill took up amateur boxing and fought and won at least 5 boxing matches while living in Yorkshire. By 1795, Bill and his family had moved to London, where he was working in the household of Thomas Pitt, Baron Camelford. Now, Pitt and Bill would visit prize fights together, and Bill continued to take part in these prize fights himself. He decided to become a professional prize fighter in the early 1800s. And with his winnings, he was able to buy the Horse and Dolphin pub near Leicester Square in London. And it was probably at this pub that he met Thomas Molyneux, another American boxer who we'll hear a bit more about in a moment. Unfortunately, his partnership with Thomas Molyneux did not end well, and Bill was forced to sell the Horse and Dolphin to cover his debts. He then took up running a boxing academy where he trained many amateur boxers, including the poet Lord Byron. Bill was chosen as an usher at the coronation of George IV in 1820 at Westminster Abbey. And you can see from these prints, all of which are from the British Museum collection, that we can spot Bill himself in Westminster Abbey, and I've blown up in larger detail 2 different copies of the coloured print, in both of which Bill can clearly be seen with the other ushers standing to the side, and in a print which shows the procession following the coronation through the streets of London, we also have evidence of the Georgian Black community. And here we see a spectator of African origin cheering on the procession in 1820. Bill became close friends with one of his former boxing opponents, Tom Cribb, and the men would often meet at Cribb's pub, the Union Arms in Westminster, and it was here that Bill spent his last evening before he died in 1829, aged 66. He is buried in the burial ground of St James's Church, Piccadilly. Now, the burial ground is located away from the church, so he's actually buried in a burial ground by the Hampstead Road in Camden. And here is Tom Molyneux, who we mentioned earlier in connection with Bill Richmond. Tom Molyneux was also born in America, probably in the state of Virginia, in 1784. He worked on an agricultural plantation and moved to New York after obtaining his freedom. He took part in boxing matches and decided in 1809 to emigrate to England to start a career as a prize fighter. Here he met Bill Richmond, who trained Tom to challenge the aforementioned Tom Cribb, owner of the Union Public House, who at that time was the national boxing champion. And they hoped that Tom Molyneux would be able to beat Tom Cribb and take the title for himself. And here we see the match between Cribb and Molyneux, with Bill Richmond behind Molyneux, acting as his trainer. Unfortunately, although the match was staged twice, on both occasions Molyneux was beaten by Cribb. Cribb and Richmond fell out, Molyneux and Richmond fell out. Tom fired Richmond as his trainer and continued to box independently. Following his failure to beat Cribb and to take the national title, he engaged in exhibition boxing matches, and went on tour in both England and Ireland. Here we see another print of one of the matches that was held to determine the title between Molyneux and Cribb, again with Bill Richmond standing behind him. And next to it, we can see an engraving of the cup that was presented at the end of the boxing match to Cribb as the winner, which shows Cribb to the right, to the left, and Molyneux to the left. Molyneux was touring in Ireland, taking part in exhibition bouts. Unfortunately, his health was declining and he suffered from tuberculosis. And he died in Galway in the summer of 1818 and is buried in St James's Graveyard, Galway. The next person we're going to meet is Billy Waters. Now, Billy Waters was born in the British colony of America around 1778. And we know very little about his early life. This is a portrait of him in the National Maritime Museum, Greenwich, showing him as a discharged serviceman from the British Navy. He was badly injured while serving in the Navy and lost the lower half of one of his legs. We know that British soldiers were we know that black soldiers were recruited from Africa, the Caribbean and the Americas to serve in the Royal Navy during the 1700s. And we see here two prints from the British Museum collections, one of which shows a black sailor on board a ship with his fellow crew members. Another one showing what we think is probably a discharged sailor alongside a soldier in a print issued to commemorate the fall of Napoleon at Waterloo. And you can see here the little in-jokes, Wellington Street, Waterloo Tavern, and a sculpture of Napoleon, which has been knocked over by the two British service people and is about to fall to the floor. Also in Trafalgar Square, we have the bronze reliefs at the bottom of Nelson's column, which show us one of the black sailors serving with Nelson on HMS Victory during the Battle of Trafalgar. Now, Billy Waters, after his discharge, forged a second career as a successful performer and musician. He played the violin and sung to entertain people outside the Adelphi Theatre on the Strand. He later took part in a play in the theatre where he represented a street performer in a play known as London Lives. And here we see him with his distinctive feathered hat, playing his violin with his wooden leg in an illustration from the play. Now, having performed in this play, Billy fell on hard times, and we know that he ended his life in the workhouse of St Giles. Previous to that, he and his family had lived in the house of a Mrs Fitzgerald in Church Street, St Giles, Camden. That part of Camden has been built over. We can see Church Street on this old map from 1794, which is where Billy would have lived. Above it, Great Russell Street, and just off the edge of that to the right would have been standing the British Museum. Billy died in St Giles Workhouse, which stood at the corner of Short's Garden and Endell Street, at the age of 45. He provided money for his family by pawning his violin shortly before he died, and he's buried in the new burial ground, St Pancras. Our next famous Black Briton is Fanny Eaton, who was born Frances Entwistle in 1835 in the British-owned colony of Jamaica. Fanny and her mother left Jamaica for Britain in the 1840s and settled in London. And it is here that Fanny started to model as an artist model for the pre-Raphaelite artists. And we have records showing that she worked at the Royal Academy, where there are records of her being paid 15 shillings for 3 sittings in July 1860. This is a painting in which she featured. The original oil painting is nowadays held by the Delaware Art Museum. And opposite, we have a print held by the British Museum, which shows Fanny posing as the mother of Moses. And we think that the young child she is holding may have been her own son, James, who she had recently given birth to. Fanny also appears in sketchbooks of the artist Joanna Boyce, which are held by the British Museum. And they were sketches for a planned painting, an oil sketch for which survives in the Yale Centre for British Art in Connecticut. Joanna Boyce unfortunately died before she was able to finish the painting. And so the sketches in the sketchbook at the British Museum and the oil sketch are all that survive of her composition. By 1867, I do apologise, by 1867, Fanny had virtually disappeared from pre-Raphaelite paintings, although we think that her daughter, a Miss Fanny Eaton, who is listed as modelling at the Royal Academy later on, may have continued working as an art model, and that her daughter Marion is listed as an artist's assistant. So the family's association with the art world continued. In 1871, Fanny and her family moved out of Camden, where they had been living, to Islington. And later on, the censuses record Fanny working as a housekeeper in Hammersmith, a cook on the Isle of Wight, before her eventual death in 1924 at the home of one of her children in Hammersmith at the age of 89. Next, we are going to meet a famous Victorian actor. This is Ira Aldridge. He was born in New York and studied at the African Free School before becoming an actor in the African Company in the city. It was the first resident Afro-American theatre in the United States. It was short-lived, however, and subject to protest, attack and discrimination, all of which encouraged Ira himself to emigrate to Liverpool in 1824 to pursue an acting career in England. Here he married and took to the stage in London, where he became most famous for his Shakespearean roles, playing the title role in Richard III and Shylock in The Merchant of Venice. Probably his most famous role was that of Othello, and here we see him in two British Museum prints from newspapers of the time, dressed as the character of Othello. He performed in Ireland and Scotland and later travelled abroad. He spent most of the final years with his family in Russia and continental Europe, where he performed at a number of theatres and royal courts. He planned to return to America for a final tour as King Lear, but unfortunately, during a tour of Poland in 1867, fell ill with pneumonia and died there. He is honoured with a brass plaque at the Shakespeare Memorial Theatre in Stratford-on-Avon. And the last famous Black Briton we are going to meet today is Olive Morris. She's shown here on a Brixton pound note, which is a form of local currency, which residents of Brixton can use in local businesses. Olive herself was born in 1952 in Jamaica, at that time a British colony until it got its full independence 10 years later in 1962. Olive and her family moved to London when she was 9. She lived in South London most of her life, going to school in Lavender Hill and Tulse Hill. Now, Olive was an active feminist, Black nationalist, and a squatters' rights campaigner. And the image we have of her on the Brixton £1 note is taken from a public campaign that she took part in, and it's a photograph which was featured in newspapers at the time and often appears in books and articles about Olive. The original is possibly held by the London Black Archives. Now, Olive co-founded the Organisation of Women and African Asian, the Organisation of Women of African and Asian Descent in London. And while she was studying economics and social sciences at Manchester University in the late 70s, she co-founded the Manchester Black Women's Cooperative. After university, she worked at Brixton Law Centre. She became ill during a trip to Spain in 1978, and when she returned to London, she was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Unfortunately, treatment was unsuccessful, and she died at St Thomas's Hospital in Lambeth in 1979 and is buried in Streatham Vale Cemetery. So we have taken ourselves through the British Museum collections from Roman to modern times, looked at a variety of Black Britons, some famous, like Ignatius Sancho, some less well known. Some we have not covered, like Mary Seacole, whose image I have yet to find in the collections. I will keep searching. I'm just glancing over at my clock and I've realised that we've now reached 12:30. There is going to be time for Q&A. If anyone feels they have to leave us now because we have come to the end of the slot allocated for the workshop, then please do. I will not be offended. But if anyone would like to stay for a Q&A session, I'm happy to stay on for as long as we need to have a chat about Black British history and people in the British Museum collections who give us evidence of Black presence in Britain back to Roman times. Thank you, Malcolm.
Thank you, Catherine. That was very, very good. I'm just going to launch a quick poll for you to do, and then I will proceed with the questions that you've put forward for Catherine. So if you could please just answer the poll, I'd be very grateful. Thank you very much. More minutes. That's brilliant. Thank you very much for this. Right, going to end the poll now. Just do that. Right, so let me just go for this bit. Raised his hand, so I'm gonna allow him to talk. So he might have a question for you. Okay, did you want to ask your question?
Unmute myself. Yep. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Richard.
Okay, great. I live in St Giles, so I was really interested to hear about Billy Waters, but I wanted to ask about something that I'm interested in. I read a few years ago a book by Simon Sharma, I think it was called Voyages, about former enslaved people who fought on the British side against the American colonists and were then, at the end of the War of Independence, brought over to Britain, where they were kind of left to their own devices. And I know that there was quite a group of them centered around the Warren Street area. And I just wondered whether there's any information in the British Museum about them. And of course, there was Cugoano, who somehow didn't appear in your presentation. I know he was very involved in supporting them. I think the original idea was that they were going to be taken over to Sierra Leone, but
Yes.
I don't know if you've got anything that you can, cast light on that subject for me at all.
Yes, certainly. Cugoano did not appear because I have yet to find his image in the British Museum collections. We have some interesting holes. As I previously mentioned, I haven't been able to find Mary Seacole, who is very famous alongside Florence Nightingale. We have many pictures of Florence Nightingale in our collections, none of Mary Seacole. And Cugoano is, again, I can't find even a print of the famous painting of him, but my search will continue. And when I find one, he will appear and talk. In terms of the St Giles area of London, now there are references in Georgian times to what are known as the St Giles Blackbirds. And it's wondered whether, as you mentioned when you said Warren Street, whether there was an established Georgian Black community in the St Giles area. You also mentioned that some of these members of the Black community may have arrived after the American War of Independence. And it is true that the British promised any enslaved person in the American colonies who fought on the British side in the War of Independence their freedom, and they were brought back to Britain. They then became what people sometimes refer to as the Georgian Black Poor. Some of them were able to forge a second career, as Billy Waters did. Others chose not to, or were not able to enter into work perhaps as a domestic servant. And that may be why the Rookery of St Giles has this additional name of the St Giles Blackbirds, because that's where the community was centred. They do pop up in the archives. They often pop up in the Old Bailey Online archives. There's a record in the Old Bailey Online archives of a Black man who was arrested and put in jail. And it says that while he was in jail, he was visited by 300 of his community who brought him food while he was in jail. So there's evidence of them, very rarely individuals, but we know that it was quite a large community in Georgian England. Numbers are very hard to ascertain. Various numbers have been proposed by historians. None of them can ever be gauged as accurate. It's possible that in Georgian England there were around 15,000 members of the Black community. It fell during Victorian times and increased again in the 20th century, but we don't know exactly how many it was.
That the whole of England?
Yes, across England, Scotland, Wales and Ireland. Most of them concentrated in the big cities in England where the employment was, particularly in London. And in terms of what you were saying about the Sierra Leone, there was a plan by the government to rehome what they saw as the poor Black community in Sierra Leone in Africa, and they set up a specific new settlement on the west coast of Africa and shipped the poor Georgian Black to Africa. The colony is not very successful in its first iteration, has a very long and complex history. There was also plans after the American Civil War to rehouse the Black community who had sided with the British in Nova Scotia after the loss of the colonies to the United States of America, as it then became. So there were a number of schemes for moving the Black population to resettlement areas around the world in North America, Nova Scotia and Africa.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And thank you for asking your question. Have we got any other questions? Let's have a quick look. There was one question that I had that someone put forward. Just going to, is Billy Waters buried in St Pancras Church, or when you say St Pancras Burial Ground, do you mean the large cemetery at East Finchley?
The new burial ground, St Pancras. So that is a very good question, because it appears that they have a separate burial ground as well, which I assume he's where he's buried, because it does specifically say the new burial ground. So I'm assuming that, as with many Victorian churches, they had to extend their burial ground away from the mother church, and that is where he was buried in Victorian times. Good question.
You mentioned Ottobar became free in 1772 following a court ruling. Did that apply to all slaves in British ownership living in the UK, or was it particularly to him?
Now this is another very, very interesting question, which ignites many a debate, and to which I'm afraid I have to start off by saying there's no clear answer. The argument that people at the time and nowadays have is with the status of slavery in Britain. Slavery existed in the British colonies, and we know that in the American colonies and the Caribbean colonies, British people who owned land there had enslaved labour transported from Africa to work on those plantations. What we don't know is whether, if those people came to Britain, they remained as a slave. And this actually became a court case for several well-known individuals. Now, I'll give you an example. Mary Prince, who lived just behind the British Museum, where Senate House now stands in Georgian times, she originally worked in the household of a plantation owner in the Caribbean. He brought her with his family to work as a domestic servant in London for him and his family. And it was then unclear whether she remained as a slave once she was on British soil. It was taken to court, and the judge ruled that she was not a slave when she was in Britain, but if she returned to the Caribbean with her owner, she would return to being an enslaved person. So there was always a bit of a grey area around whether slavery existed as a legal category in Britain at the same time as it existed in the wider empire. And the legal rulings, I think you should see them more as like a case that sets a precedent. So if you have a legal question and you're not sure what the answer is, you take it to court and the court decides. The court, by deciding that Black people in Britain were free, implies that before that they were enslaved. In fact, what the court ruling does is it confirms the idea that once you set foot on British soil, you are no longer an enslaved person. You might be the employee of someone, but you are not legally enslaved. So when we talk about freedom after the Somerset case, what Somerset was doing was he was actually pondering this question of, can you be a slave in Britain, making a ruling which then cleared up the issue. What it didn't do was stop you being an enslaved person in the colonies. And that was where some abolitionists then had arguments with people like William Wilberforce, because there is a delay between an announcement that you cannot be enslaved in Britain and a legal ruling that you are not enslaved in the British Empire colonies overseas. So it's a very interesting question, and one that continues to be debated nowadays. Was there ever slavery in Britain?
That's a very thorough answer. Thank you, Catherine. That's very good. Just to say, made a comment. If he died at St Giles Workhouse, then he would have been buried in the St Giles Overspill burial ground at St Pancras Old Church. Thank you very much.
I shall make a note. That's very good to know. Yes, he definitely died in the workhouse. He was there for the last 10 days of his life. He was taken in due to failing health. Before he went in, as I said, he pawned his violin so there'd be some money left for his family. After 10 days in the workhouse, unfortunately, his health did not recover and he died.
That's great. So that concludes our talk today. Thank you, Catherine. I'm sure everyone says that. Marcus said the only complaint he had, it was too short. So, but I know you could have filled it out a lot longer.
Oh, goodness. Let me tell you, Malcolm, I'm going to continue looking in collections online. And if I ever find any more images, then we can have Famous Black Britons part 2. And in fact, I have to say, if anyone does do a search on collections online, there are a huge number of unnamed Africans who their lives are captured in images held by the British Museum. And I could do a whole talk on those. Today, I tried to concentrate on people for whom we had a name and a life story, but that wider Black community is certainly evidenced within our collections. Domestic servants in Georgian London in particular, and some of the images are joyful. And yes, certainly if people would be interested, then I'm happy to do an unnamed Black Britons talk.
Cool, that's very nice. Just one quick comment from the Somerset case ruled by Lord Mansfield said that enslaved people could not be taken away from Britain against their will. There we go. Next week's talk is on Rome and Britain. I hope to see you all then. Thank you, Catherine. And that concludes us for the day. Cheers.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye, everyone. Lovely to be with you this morning. Thank you. Bye-bye.